Excellent. Looks like we're starting here. Welcome, everyone. We thank you for joining us today. My name is Brian Basinger, and I'm an intellectual property, privacy, and cybersecurity attorney here at Nexsen Pruet. Briefly, cybersecurity is an area I'm really passionate about and became involved with early on in my career as a software engineer. Throughout my practice, I've witnessed the importance of cybersecurity, and I believe that this is an area that requires effective counsel. With that being said, joining me today is my talented colleague and co-presenter, Ms. Kirsten Small.
Hey everyone, I'm glad to be here today and glad to have you with us. I am in the business litigation group at Nexsen Pruet and also a privacy attorney. And like Brian, this is an area to which I bring sort of a lot of passion and a sense of mission. I think this is an important issue for a lot of companies to manage these issues, and glad to be here to talk about some of them today.
Excellent. We are excited about hosting today for Tales from the Front Lines, Managing Cyber Risk in the Life Sciences Industry. This is the 6th installment of Nexsen Pruet's new Life Sciences webinar series. Both Kirsten and I are passionate about the intersection of technology and law. Today, we will identify the particular cybersecurity risks facing life science companies, including the increasing prevalence of ransomware attacks. We will also discuss the most common vectors of cyber attacks and provide common sense tips on how to reduce vulnerability in cyber attacks. Lastly, we'll take a few examples and walk through these breaches, how they occurred, and what we can take from them. As we get started, I encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You will see a chat box to the right-hand side. Please insert questions as they arise, and we will take them in kind. Thank you. All right. Why are companies in life sciences industry at greater risk? And we'll go to the next slide here. This is mainly due to data plus innovation. Recent statistics from Deloitte have pointed out that roughly 80% of an early stage life science company is in intellectual property. And that is a lot of value for potential attackers. R&D, intellectual property, the personal information, personal health information. Where this risk comes into play is typically when mergers and acquisitions occur, venture funding, and then obviously regulators such as the FTC. When we talk about mergers and acquisitions, the thought is when a data breach occurs or a cybersecurity incident occurs, the loss of that intellectual property, the loss of the personal identifiable information can result in a tremendous loss on the balance sheet. And Kirsten will talk to you a little bit later about some of those numbers, but it is certainly an issue and one that comes up, and we'll discuss some of the avenues of how it comes up in regard to mergers and acquisitions. The same with venture funding. Venture funding, a possibility of losing for future financing rounds, the possibility of having investors wanting out of the organization due to a cybersecurity incident. And then lastly, regulators such as the FTC or attorney generals, the focus brings negative press and can also be quite detrimental to the balance sheet, and especially in an early stage life science organization or any stage of organization.
I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to take this one and talk a little bit about one of the reasons life sciences companies are so vulnerable. It has to do with especially the medical information they may have. And I thought this slide was a really useful way to sort of illustrate what hackers are looking for when they're trying to get your information and all the ways that they can use it. And so this is sort of a four quadrants of what they can do with this data. And then I think the even more interesting slide is the next one. These are the values of personal information on the dark web. So depending on what the type of information is, it's worth different amounts. But if you look at sort of down toward the bottom, a complete EHR database is $500,000 on the dark web. So there's a profit motive here. for these companies for these hackers to go after this information, which is one of the reasons life sciences companies do face extra vulnerability, because they have such valuable information.
Yeah, and one thing to note here is this is from 2017 to 2018.
Mhm.
These values have likely increased. We're seeing these incidents more and more often. And if we could just bump back to the last slide, Kirsten, I'll chat a few words about that. When we talk about medical identity theft, that's an area where, taking another's identity for insurance or other purposes. And then the weaponizing healthcare data, that's what we're seeing with ransomware, which you'll typically see with extortion of money or other finances. And I just want to kind of highlight those two. The weaponizing is typically what you'll see in the news. X group has now locked the databases for Y insurance company or Y life science company. And those can be pretty damning as far as public relations go, and requires quite a bit of coordination, cooperation with your various government entities. But I just wanted to get a few words on this. This is a really good slide, and we can go ahead and advance from there.
Sure. And actually, do you want to say one additional word about that bottom left quadrant, the financial fraud? I think it's worth pointing out here that even if it's medical records, some of the information in there is valuable for entirely unrelated purposes. Lots of medical records have social security numbers in them as a means of identification, and hackers can use those to submit false tax returns, which I will tell you has happened to me. It's super fun. So
yeah,
all kinds of stuff in there.
Right. Yeah, there's more data in health records than you expect, and certainly with health trials and the like. And then we'll address down the line the different states and as well as the state and federal bifurcation as far as these incidents go. But that's a great point, Kirsten.
Right, so let's move on.
Okay, so why are they at risk? Why are life sciences companies at risk? It's high risk data. It's a very intimate data. It's PII, and that data is also significant when we look at, say, drug trials, or we're looking at our FDA approval testing, or any other information that we may be garnering. It's high risk data. And I know we previously touched on some data such as trade secrets in another lesson, but that is a part of this high risk data, leaving the company through, say, insiders, as well as regulatory oversight. Life sciences companies have a high degree of regulatory oversight, and under that, there's certainly more scrutiny. There's more compliance measures that need to take place. There's certainly more requirements similar to that of the finance industry. And so that's another reason why they're more at risk. And then also the active M&A market. The transactions between these organizations open up a cornucopia of risks involved. In one brief example, you're a large entity acquiring a smaller life science company that doesn't have adequate IT security or has perhaps an open database, and we'll cover some examples later on. You bring them in and they have access now to touch your database. You now have essentially a vulnerability on the periphery of your system, and those attacks are common. And so because of these active acquisitions of organizations, and similarly with mergers, blending two organizations together, syncing the IT systems, it's a very arduous and complex task. And it does have the possibility for opening up vulnerabilities.
Right, and to that point, not just even the tech systems, but also the human systems. You've got two cultures of organizations merging together that may have different attitudes toward privacy and security, or may not have enough knowledge about the other's data to understand what's secure and what needs to be secure and what doesn't. So all those aspects of the merger are important to consider. So this slide sort of encapsulates a little bit about the cost of a cyber attack. And sort of summarizes some of the things we've been talking about here, but I thought it was a useful illustration of the things that immediately come to mind when you're thinking about costs and the things that are less obvious but are still important. So on top of the line, you'll see the cost of investigation, of post-breach consumer notification. For example, if you've got a social security number involved in the breach, you're going to need to be providing identity theft protection. The public relations issues can be severe, and you might need help with those. Attorney's fees and litigation, not only to manage the breach response, but also any regulatory investigation or litigation that may come out of that. And then, of course, the last one over on the right there is cybersecurity improvements. So those are all the obvious things we know about or think about immediately. But even underneath that, you think about some of the things we've been talking about this morning. You know, your increased cost of insurance, of raising debt because you're less creditworthy, the lost contracts or business you may have, the loss of intellectual property is of course, a large one in this area. And the lost value of customer relationships. If you have had a data breach, your clients and customers may perceive you as being less trustworthy, and you can suffer a loss there as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we touched on this a little bit earlier with regard to VC funding, and then certainly mergers and acquisitions. You know, companies that are looking to acquire you, if you do face a breach, that is going to slow down the due diligence process. That is going to really complicate the state of affairs. So, you know, one thing we'll talk about a little bit later on as well is these attacks aren't just happening to your Fortune 500 companies. In fact, they actually tend to be happening more commonly across middle to small size companies and companies where perhaps the presumption by the attacker is the organization is maybe less sophisticated or less prepared. And that's why we're here to try to communicate to you that, you know, these attacks are happening with more frequency. They're becoming more sophisticated. Increased training is needed amongst employees. This is an area that, you know, there should be a focus from the C-suite on down, and really a harmonization with the IT department and C-suite leaders.
Agreed, and really from the outset of any company too, I think it's important to mention you're not too small to hack. No company is too small to hack if you use data. So something to keep in mind.
That's absolutely right. Even the smallest of companies can have, you know, PII or data that can be really detrimental to their consumers.
So this is just a quick slide that sort of gives a graphic representation of the causes of breach. And this is a slide from 2018, but it really has not changed a whole lot. The malicious outsider attacks, the phishing attacks, ransomware, we'll talk some about, are most common. But you also have unauthorized access, and theft or mistake is usually the insider threat. We'll talk about a little bit about the employee who makes an error and lets information out, or who takes it with them, as we've discussed in a previous webinar. So Brian,
yes, go ahead, Chris. You want it?
Oh, I was just saying, you go ahead.
Okay, yeah, human error. So that's the one we see quite often, right? That's the I changed my password to my first and last name 01. I left my laptop at a Starbucks opened and unlocked. I don't have perhaps two-factor authentication. I dump my hard drive on a USB and leave it on a bus. Human error is the effective means of addressing that is through proper training. Training through all levels of the organization. And that's just, you know, that's something that's key. That's something that should be a part of a routine program, and to involve IT with malicious outsiders. And one thing we want to discuss here, and this came up in a previous lecture that we had, this does not mean your vulnerabilities within, say, Mac OS X, or your vulnerabilities within Windows. The attackers we're talking about here perhaps are your spear phishing, your phishing attacks, your whaling attacks for high-ranking individuals within the organization. And those are, those are the ones we're concerned about. And one thing with these quote unquote zero-day attacks, or the attacks that are more directed towards, say, operating systems and the like, those are things that regulation from the FTC, and Kirsten mentioned this earlier, and she can elaborate a little more, but the amount of reasonableness, and that's a key factor of how you defend in an argument, say, against the FTC, were your measures that you put in place reasonable? And we'll touch on that a little bit more. Ransomware, that's your lock your database and encrypt it and don't give you the key. Those are what you're seeing in the news quite a bit. Insider threats are that really touches on trade secrets, and we did have a conversation on trade secrets, but you've seen insider threats with relation to the self-driving vehicles and the automobile companies. That's been where perhaps an engineer will leave with certain data. There's certainly ways to manage that through access controls and other programs, but it's something to be mindful of. Inadequate resources. This really touches kind of all of the above. One thing we chatted about, Kirsten and I, before we began, was sometimes just picking the lowest cost vendor is not the right choice. It really, in this area, there are quite a few options, and this is where, with competent counsel, you can really get together and vet the different vendors and tailor a program with your IT department that makes sense for the organization in spend and also in protection. And then obviously supply chain risks, risks with your suppliers, risks with who you're delivering to as well.
Right. And one point I want to make here is that these are not necessarily entirely separate categories. One thing I've seen a lot recently is ACH fraud, or business email compromise, which I view as a combination of a malicious outsider and a human error. You get email or a fax that looks like it comes from your vendor or from your customer that says, hey, our banking information has changed. Can you please send the payment to this new wiring address? And it's in fact someone who's infiltrated the system and is posing as your vendor or your customer. And in fact, the money is going to go to a bank account someplace in Eastern Europe and you're never going to see it again. There are ways to protect against that. And having those systems in place just requires a little bit of forethought and being prepared for that, to avoid those human errors that can let those hackers succeed in getting that money rerouted.
Absolutely. Yeah, these social engineering attacks are becoming more and more advanced. We're seeing even more targeting even the legal industry. And so the life sciences industry is certainly primed for it. There's a level of size to it, as well as the varying sizes that allow for quite a few vulnerabilities. And so really, along with having the right vendors or having the right software in place, effective training is key, and it should be routine. There should be a program put into place that also tests the competence of that training, whether or not it's actually sinking in with employees, whether or not it's working. And those are things that we've worked with organizations on and really helped them kind of get to that point where they feel comfortable with what they're doing is educating the personnel and really bringing the company up to speed as it relates to these attacks.
Right. And along those lines, one of the things I often tell my clients is that a small error is a big blessing for the company, because it lets you sort of see where your vulnerabilities are before you have a big loss or a big attack. And so there's always learning occasions.
Yep. Opportunities for growth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one size does not fit all. And this is really going back to reasonableness and the level of protection. there's varying life cycles with life sciences companies, and what that means is you could be an early stage growth company. You could be really an agile development, small lean team, up to a very large team. But you could all be possessing, PHI or PII, and that information would leave you vulnerable, vulnerable to the FTC, and compromise the company. And one thing with the varying life cycles is certain pieces are more equivocal to in more data. So for instance, during a trial for FDA certification, you open up a trial to 5,000 some individuals. Well, at an early, that's a point in your life cycle where you will become increasingly vulnerable for attack. As things come in, as more people access the database, as you have more data input, you're perhaps onboarding engineers to facilitate some of that, or other things. So these are certainly areas that we want to pay attention to. Certainly also prior to due diligence, the data room, the access to the data room, how are things being transmitted, etc. These are all things we need to contemplate. Further, there's a wide range of technologies with life science companies. I used to joke with several of our medical colleagues in hospitals, physicians, about the lack of up-to-date technology, and it's advancing at a really fast rate with electronic health records and the like, and new protocols such as FHIR and other standards. But incorporating all this technology and making the lives easier is also bringing in more vulnerabilities. So those are certainly things that we want to be mindful of, and certainly things that when you do incorporate new systems or software, that would also have to be vetted extensively. And we'll go back to the kind of vendor contracts and contracts, but there's a certain amount of risk shifting that can occur, and we encourage certainly life science companies to have competent counsel that's familiar with these types of transactions, that can spot the issues and really focus in on what's going on. And then the last point I touched a little bit on: pre-commercial and commercial companies. Revenue models change for that, and that's pretty known. Okay.
Okay. So next couple of slides are a few headlines that you may have seen regarding various exploits affecting life sciences companies, and just want to sort of mention a couple of highlights for a couple of them. So many of you probably recall a Fitbit data exposure had to do with an army base in the Middle East, where Fitbit was tracking locations of soldiers as they were taking their running route, and that outlined very precisely the location of the base. So the exposure of that data was really a national security vulnerability. That third one there, Walgreens, their testing registration system, I'm willing to bet they used a vendor for that and hadn't adequately vetted the vendor. So there's another risk we've talked about. The next slide, I want to sort of mention that top one, and we'll come back to this. Improper hard drive disposal left data vulnerable. If you are a North Carolina company in the life sciences, this is a particular concern for you. North Carolina has a statute that deals with proper disposal of personal health information and personal identifying information. And we'll come back to that. And last one, you see that under employee email misuse. It's often the case that a lot of the human error that we see comes in from attaching the wrong document to an email and sending it out. So there's those risks as well.
Okay, great. We're going to go back to, we started chatting a little bit briefly about risks during M&A activity, and I want to just really kind of highlight this. And there's several really good deep forensic accounts on some of these larger accounting websites that will show you kind of the loss of value. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of value in a company. The IP alone was accounted for, estimated at early stage, 80% of the company's value. And so, the importance of cyber security and involving a system and having IT that's capable of handling the organization's PII is extremely important if the goal of the organization is to either be acquired or merge with another company.
And if I could just jump in on that point,
Yeah,
Brian,
please.
one thing we know is that companies that were developing, that were involved in developing vaccines for COVID-19 immediately became subject to much greater rate of attacks for ransomware and hacking. So particularly if you've got an innovative technology or product, when the press reports start coming out about your company, you're going to face more risk there.
Absolutely. These attackers are sophisticated and they will follow the money, so to speak. So it's certainly an increasing vulnerability for organizations both large and small. Also competitive advantage. A lot of this goes back to your trade secrets. And if you're developing a new method or process, or you have information, and this can be really detrimental on the software side. Say you're doing computer vision with patients on leukemia, and that algorithm, that information leaves. It's a loss of extreme competitive advantage. Most often, some of that software is not wrapped up in patents, and so if it's a trade secret, the fundamentals of the trade secret, maybe it wasn't adequately protected. And so this is one area of focus that, if the cat's out of the bag, it's hard to get it back in. And that's a tough pill to swallow when you're in such a competitive marketplace. And then transaction delays. If you're involved in litigation at the FTC, your acquisition or merger may be delayed. Similarly, if you don't have access to your data, or if you're in a ransomware attack, and you will likely have increased costs because of it, which is, speaks for itself. Next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, some due diligence is really identify the data that's at risk. We often call this data mapping, and that's kind of mapping out what data you have, identifying where the crown jewels are. Where are your trade secrets that are your money makers? Where's all the PII at? Where's your PHI at? Is it being protected? What vendors and third parties have access to it? And really mapping that out. And then, this goes to other things such as penetration testing. Really testing your system and understanding, is it vulnerable? Are all our ports open? Are we up to date? Is our software systems up to date? Are we using the latest patches? And this is, it may seem trivial to folks with that type of a background, but there are systems that may be antiquated, perhaps under licensing programs with the vendor, or how they update schedule is. So it's really important to review these contracts, vet them to ensure that the potential data is not at risk, and to stay on top of compliance measures.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that when it comes to, we'll talk about this more at vendor risk, but you really are only as secure as your least secure vendor. Would you say that's true, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's a great statement, because it only takes one, and then the information's out there. And Kirsten touched earlier on the dark web and the web. There are repositories where these data files are monetized, and it has to be lucrative or they wouldn't do it. So it's something we need to be aware of. And one thing that kind of echoes throughout this is staying in compliance with training and vendors, and reviewing those documents and having competent counsel that can handle those documents and situations.
The next slide, I sort of jumped ahead. It was a little bit getting into that, but let's talk a little bit about supply chain risk too.
Yeah. So I guess I've already kind of touched on this slide. The supply chain is in life sciences is heavily involved with vendors and third parties and contracting out with them to do certain aspects. Our personal work has shown that our life science clients use quite a few vendors. And typically they'll get the vendor's terms of service in and master service agreement and just have it reviewed by say a commercial counsel and check the boxes as far as the industry goes. But there really needs to be a deeper dive on sort of the risks that they may face with regard to cybersecurity, and possibly looking at risk shifting and vulnerabilities there. And then, Kirsten, you want to touch base on this cross-border issue?
Sure. It's sort of a cliche to say that we're part of a global economy, but we really are, and especially in life sciences areas where you do have a lot of cutting edge research and development, a lot of data analysis. We see a lot of exchanges of data across borders. There's a few issues here, but the cybersecurity ones are particularly delicate between the United States and Europe right now. There are rules in place that govern the security of data as it crosses borders. And they're a little bit in flux right now, but in general, protections in Europe are much more stringent than they are in the United States, both in terms of personal privacy protections and in terms of security for moving information. And so one of the issues that US companies are dealing with right now is establishing to the satisfaction of European regulatory authorities that our cybersecurity mechanisms are adequate. I know that's a whole topic sort of beyond the scope of this, but it is an issue that companies in the life sciences need to be aware of if you are transferring data, if you're involved in a clinical trial, for example. You may find yourself having inquiries as a vendor of a larger company to show that you are adequately cyber secure so they can transfer that information to you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the European Union has taken a stronger stance as far as PII goes. And so there is certainly more regulation across the pond. So that is certainly one thing to be aware of with supply chain risk and transacting data across the countries. The last point here being the use of technology increases vulnerability. And we mentioned it earlier, but incorporating different software pieces, adding plugins and different modules and resourcing different libraries. Each step and layer of complexity increases vulnerability. And that's just the nature of the industry. That's how it works. Using a plurality of vendors increases the amount of vendors that may be targeted for a breach. So that's just one thing to be aware of as you grow the business or as the business develops, to understand map data and understand the amount of technology as it increases. It also increases risk.
So let's talk a little bit about managing risk. And I think it's really important to emphasize that word managing. There's no such thing as eliminating risk in this area, but it is about managing it, about having reasonable standards to protect your data and your information. And bearing in mind that it's not one and done, it's an ongoing process. It is something that is going to be just as much a part of developing your product as developing your sophistication in this area of cybersecurity and privacy. So we need to think about it in terms of managing risk rather than eliminating it. So in cyber risks, we've talked a little bit about this already, and just to highlight, the amount of training you have for your employees, access restrictions. If you have really sensitive data and not everyone needs to see it, make sure not everyone can see it. Establishing these things sort of from the outset are really important to making sure that you have managed that risk as much as you possibly can. And Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about vendor risks and contractual obligations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, with regard to vendor risks, that's really if the contract's going to dictate the arrangement, and uh, there's often times where there's certain negotiation tactics that may be used at the front side of onboarding a vendor. Now, within this space, there is quite a few vendors. There, you do have options, and this goes back to the one size does not fit all. Certain capabilities just simply are not required out of organizations, say very small organizations that have limited PII. If they encrypt their network, they have two individuals that have access and they're co-owners. They're not going to need a large amount of access control and securities outside of those two. And this also kind of goes back to reasonableness. One thing about vendors is there's a lot of public information out there on vendors. There's a lot of statistics on vendors. There's, this is an area that we encourage our clients to shop for. Find the best vendor that suits your needs. Find a vendor that's reputable within the area, that has their certification, has their NIST training, and that has a workforce that's capable of handling it. One key aspect of vendors is a sub-assignment. Quite frankly, I don't like vendors that can sub-assign work. If they can give work out to another party, you've created another layer of potential vulnerability. And so that's really a thing with these vendor contracts, is to take a strong review of it towards compliance, but also any potential vulnerabilities as well as risk shifting.
Right. And on that point, in terms of the litigation risk that may occur, or regulatory oversight, that regulator or that court is going to look at you as the person who retained that vendor, or the company that retained that vendor. They're not going to push the responsibility off to the vendor. It's your responsibility to make sure that the vendor you selected is protecting your information. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get down to some of the FTC cases. And then malicious outsiders, we've talked about this already. Again, it's a question of being prepared and having the systems in place, and training your people, and taking advantage of pen testing and learning from small mistakes so you avoid the big ones.
Yep, that's right. And malicious outsiders can range from everything from nation states down to your typical in a basement plugging away at the keyboard. This isn't a stereotype of anybody. It's just to say that the amount of sophistication can be really high, where it's a attack on, say, a cross-scripting attack, or it could be something as simple as social engineering, where someone uses an email that looks similar, spells Apple A-P-L-E, and then sends an email requesting login credentials. This is the malicious outsiders are really varied, and something that's very tough to kind of pinpoint where the next vulnerability or attack will be.
Right. And protecting against those risks is sometimes as simple as making sure you're patching your software when patches come out. Be aware of those things. And just keeping up to date with that from a day-to-day perspective. And there's insurance. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take this. So, as long as my phone doesn't ring, sorry about that. Consider the risks you need to insure against. So, cybersecurity insurance is not under a typical general liability insurance policy. We've seen that where clients believe a general liability will cover them for cybersecurity incidents. Most often it's not. This is a policy that is outside of that. They're not standardized. There's a high degree of variability within these policies. And one basis of that is the industry is relatively new. It doesn't have the hundreds of years of data, such as home insurance or the like, so or life insurance, etc. So there is quite a bit of vulnerability here, or variability, excuse me. And then let's see, Kirsten, I think you've got a probably stronger background on those last two here.
Sure, and I think one point to make is there's a difference between a crime policy, a crime protection policy, and a cyber insurance policy. I've seen a lot of clients that have crime policies that are not protected against, for example, the ACH fraud or the business email compromise that I see a lot. Those policies tend to be much more narrow than a cyber security policy. And for that reason, they don't quite provide as much protection. So they may look like a cost savings, but ultimately you are, if you end up being the victim of a hack like that, you're going to end up paying more because you won't have the coverage that you need to recover those losses. So it's really important to consider the advantages of having specific cybersecurity coverage, and then looking at that coverage to make sure that it's suited to your business. Again, it really is not a one-size-fits-all situation. You need to sort of consider what your insurer is offering. And I also would say that insurers are a great resource for helping you protect your information. They have an interest in making sure you don't get breached or hacked.
That's exactly.
So, your insurer is really your partner here, I think, in a lot of ways, and can be very helpful in that respect. Okay, so we are now sort of segueing into my area. One of the things I do a lot is assist companies that have had data breaches. And so I want to just sort of touch on this very briefly about sort of responding to a data breach when it happens. And really, you have 4 really critical resources. First of all, your insurer. Hopefully, you've got cybersecurity insurance. You can call your insurer and get some assistance. Legal counsel to make sure your investigation is protected by attorney-client privilege. You're going to need an outside forensic investigator to help remedy the breach. And depending on the circumstances, you may want to retain some assistance from crisis management to help manage those PR communications, just assist you with messaging and sort of taking that bit of it off your plate, because if you've got a major data breach, you've got plenty to do. One of the questions I get a lot is notification. Once you've had a breach, you may need to notify individuals that their personal information has been affected. And I like this slide because it shows the simple fact that every state has its own data breach notification law, and they're all a little bit different. So it's important to know where the data is that you've lost and how to respond to it. I do want to touch briefly on South Carolina and North Carolina. And in South Carolina, like in most states, personally identifying information is usually your first name or first initial, last name, plus some other form of identifying information, your social security number, your driver's license number, a financial account number, if you can get into the account from it. So fairly common sense stuff. North Carolina is a little bit different. North Carolina is a little bit broader. It includes your digital signature. It includes biometric data, so a retinal scan, fingerprints, other data that a life sciences company can collect, may be protected under North Carolina law. But North Carolina specifically excludes certain other forms of information. So it's a little bit more nuanced than the South Carolina provision.
This is a really good point here, because across all the states, they're different. So for instance, ISP and email address in California is considered PII.
Right, and it is in Europe too.
Exactly. So the most life science companies are not only within one territory; they're in multiple territories. So we really have just the purpose of showing kind of North Carolina and South Carolina is just to show this discrepancy between those two. But that equation grows even larger as we look across other countries and other states here.
Right. And even within the United States, sometimes state requirements for notification conflict with each other. So if you have a data breach involving individuals who live in Massachusetts and individuals who live in New Jersey, you can't send the same notification letter to both of them, because you will violate each other state's law doing that. So it's a complex area, in part because we don't have a federal privacy law yet. Hopefully one day we will get there, but we're not there yet. I do want to make one additional point about North Carolina law. that North Carolina has a specific statute addressing destruction of personally identifying information that has to be destroyed in a secure manner to make sure that you can't just dump the hard drive in the dumpster. You've got to actually destroy the hard drive, delete the data, and make sure that it's actually gone so that it can't be recovered by somebody after it's been disposed of. Okay, so we've mentioned a few times today the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of its missions is consumer protection, but it has been reading that mission is increasingly involving cybersecurity and reading cybersecurity as being an unfair trade practice. So we've seen a lot of enforcement actions against a variety of companies, including life sciences companies, dealing with inadequate cybersecurity practices, misrepresentation of policies and practices, and health apps and connected devices. And on that last one, even just this month, on September 15th, the FTC issued a policy statement regarding their health breach notification rule, which applies to companies that are not covered by HIPAA, that are not healthcare providers in the traditional sense. But if you have an app, for example, a diabetes tracking app where you've got people putting in their blood sugar, that is covered by this health breach notification rule. And so you need to be aware of that, and you need to be aware that if you have a loss of information, that this is an FTC issue and you need to look at their rules as far as notification, because they may be different than some state rules. And we'll circle back to that a little bit when we talk about some enforcement. So I want to talk just briefly about a couple of the FTC's enforcement cases addressing life sciences companies, because I think they sort of highlight the areas where the FTC is really concerned with cybersecurity and life sciences. SkyMed is a company that offers essentially medical insurance or medical protection for travelers in a variety of ways. And of course, in order to get that protection, you need to provide them with your health information so they can actually provide treatment in the event of an emergency. And SkyMed did a couple of things that the FTC was unhappy about, one of which was they had a little symbol on their website that indicated they were HIPAA compliant. There is no certifying organization for HIPAA compliance, and so the FTC viewed that as a false statement about their practices. More importantly, from a cybersecurity standpoint, they did not actually adequately protect the information that was going out. They did not vet their vendors. They did not make sure the vendors weren't giving information to third parties. So the FTC brought an action against them in part for what they called unfair information security practices, for not adequately protecting their information. Another one we want to talk about is INRI Flow Health, which is a really important example of a startup company. Flow is an app that tracks periods and fertility cycles and is intended to help women sort of keep track of those things for pregnancy and childbearing purposes. And this is partially a cybersecurity issue and partially a privacy issue. As Brian mentioned earlier, it's important when you have vendors to sort of see what they can do with your information. INRI Flow Health did not do that. They simply retained vendors and accept their terms of service and didn't worry about where the information was going. And it's important to know that these are pretty common vendors. It was Facebook, it was Google Analytics, it was a customer relations management company. So by not making sure that how those companies handled their information, it exposed Flow Health to vulnerability. And the other thing that the FTC highlighted was the promises that Flow had made. And this is the thing I talk to a lot of my clients about. I do a lot of privacy policies. And if you make a promise, you need to keep the promise. And so one of the things that Flow Health was promising was that they would not share your personal health information with anybody, period, end of sentence. And yet they were sharing all of that information with all of their vendors. So that was one of the reasons for the FTC's enforcement action.
Yep, that's a common one. I think that companies get compliant with that. Vendors are just an extension of them. They're an arm of them, but they are third parties. They have their own interests, and their contracts are drafted for their own interests. So, in the situation of Flow Health, the data actually was utilized for marketing and advertising towards women during using that information, outside of flows control. And so, that's ripe within the FTC, that's ripe within privacy and cybersecurity. And it's something as simple as a vendor contract that should have been reviewed and should have, had Flow made statements that, our vendors have access to the data. They would have fared far better in front of the FTC.
Right, and that's a really good point, Brian. There's two ways to sort of think of this. It's in terms of keeping an eye on your vendors and not letting them do whatever they want with your data, but also disclosing what's happening with the data that you collect.
Yes.
They're sort of two sides of the same coin as far as the FTC is concerned.
Yeah, that's where most folks get in trouble. They tend to lie or extend the truth to the degree. If you are using third-party processors that are going to be using the PII for other means, disclose it. This isn't a time to play hide the ball, and certainly it's not illegal to have a vendor utilize a vendor service. Your customer should know that, and the folks that you have data on should be aware of that.
Right, and a great example of that is an action by the FTC against a company called Enroll Me, which had to do with eliminating spam from people's email inboxes. In order to do that, Enroll Me had access to your entirety of the inbox. And when a consumer complained about that and said, look at all this information they've collected, the FTC didn't take action. They said, look, if you read the privacy policy, it's in there. They told you they were doing this.
Yep.
So you haven't, so there's that disclosure piece of it that's really important. And speaking of, sort of keeping your promises, I thought this was an interesting one. This is the last one we'll talk about. Taplock is a fingerprint secured lock. It's a Canadian company. The FTC took an action against them for deceptive security practices. Researchers found that it was actually pretty darn easy to hack one of these locks, despite Taplock saying they were bold, sturdy, and secure. Apparently, it was easy to get physical access to the lock by simply unscrewing the back panel. The other thing, and this goes back to what we were just talking about with Flow Health, is Taplock had a privacy policy, and their privacy policy said, in part, to protect your personal information, we take reasonable precautions and follow industry best practices. In fact, Taplock didn't have any security practices. It didn't have any sort of security program to protect information. And this goes to the danger of having your web developer draft your privacy policy, because they were making a promise they weren't keeping. And the FTC called them out for that.
Yep.
There's vulnerabilities here, not just from the hacking elements we talked about, but the worst part of it is sort of insult to injury. You get through the hack, and then all of a sudden you've got the FTC knocking at your door, or a state attorney general knocking at your door.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the website developers. We have a lot of clients who they rely on their developer to put a template form up, and I think that's one of the most dangerous practices that can occur is to put a set of promises on your website that you haven't vetted personally through your IT department and through leadership to ensure that is what the organization is doing. I think that's just one step that perhaps isn't scrutinized enough, but these policies matter. The FTC takes actions against Fortune 500 all the way down to 5-employee companies, and so no one's safe from these actions. And I know it may seem financially smart at the time to accept a template policy, but you may be increasing your costs in the long term by doing such.
Right. I think that's what we've got for today.
Excellent. Well, we thank you for joining us for this 6th iteration. I've enjoyed it. It's always great to be with my colleague, Kirsten. We're right down the hall here in Greenville, South Carolina, and it's been a pleasure being able to present to you, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.